Greetings, one and all. This is Video Game Growing Pains, and today we're actually talking about a somewhat controversial issue in Final Fantasy. Yes, it's that time. We are talking Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. Now, a lot of you might assume that I'm actually pretty down on the series for what it did with Crystal Chronicles. Actually, that's not entirely true. I rather like Crystal Chronicles, in all honesty. What it comes down to is this: Crystal Chronicles is not the same as my classic Final Fantasy, and I'm okay with that. I don't like every game in it, but I can admire what it was trying to do. So, with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about Crystal Chronicles. First, a little background. Final Fantasy originally appeared on the Nintendo and the Famicom, as I discussed in my earlier videos. Now, it migrated to the PlayStation, but there was always a big fan demand for a return to form. The Gamecube actually offered a little bit of an opportunity with that you didn't normally get to see in other situations. What did that mean? Well, it meant that we were going to get a new Final Fantasy, but that it would be different from what we're used to. Way different. What do I mean? How different? Well, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, the original game, was set in a totally different world with a totally different mythos. We didn't really have a lot of the usual suspects like Bahamut or a lot of the normal monsters. We did get some normal monsters like your Marlboros and your Arimans, but generally it was meant to be a separate world. A world divided by races with the Hooms, the Selkies, the Lilties, and the cripes, I can never remember the last one. The Ukes, I believe? They were all different genders and races, and the original Crystal Chronicles was built around four-player cooperative. You could hook your GBA up to your GameCube and use it with your friends to play a four-player co-op RPG. This is fantastic if you've got four friends. I played it by myself and it was an absolute slog and a grind. The basic story comes down to this, okay? What happened is that, how best to describe this? Well, what happens is simply that the world goes all kinds of to hell. There is mist that is poisonous coming out of every single area, and the poisonous mist is actually doing a lot of damage to the environment. So, well, in order to keep the towns and villages safe, the cities have to actually get crystal juice, basically. Not juice, but, something to replenish the crystals from caravans who have mini crystals to keep them safe from the mist. And that is your goal for the largest part of the game. Your goal is to, well, replenish the crystals, to keep your town alive, and to explore to try and find more information about why the world went to hell all of a sudden. It's not very compelling. I'm going to be honest with you. But at the same time, it could be a lot worse. I generally think that the game is pretty interesting for what it tried to do. And while I don't necessarily like the fact that, it is a basic action RPG, and when I say basic, I mean bloody basic. There's really not much more than hit guys or spell guys, and it's all done in real time, and it doesn't really feel connected. The art style is certainly interesting. I don't know if I really like it. It's different from all the Final Fantasies we've seen before. It has some charm to it because each of the races looks unique. Like, the Ukes are covered in armor, the Selkies are your standard elf-like women, the Lilties have, like, little onion heads. They're kind of cute. It's, graphically, the game is okay. The music is okay. If you've got four players, it's actually pretty fun. If you don't, it's terrible. That's what I'm going to say about Crystal Chronicles. It was a different world. It was a different setting. It was meant to be a different Final Fantasy. And I don't hate it that much because of that, mostly. I don't hate it because it wasn't trying to be a new Final Fantasy. It wasn't trying to be the next great thing. It was perfectly fine with just being its own little separate thing, its own little part of the Final Fantasy universe. That's okay. That's cool. And so, well, it's not bad, but I wouldn't seek it out, honestly, even if you have friends, because it's just so basic. The end of the game does give you a few cool twists. For example, the story is basically non-existent, but you basically take some of the small adventures you've been going on, the dungeons, and those turn into memories which you can use to fight the last boss. It's a little cheesy and hokey at times, but it's got a lot of heart to it. It's okay. I want to talk about two of the games that I haven't really played that much, just to get them out of the way. That would be Final Fantasy Ring of Fate and the other Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles game. These were your standard action RPG games. They were very similar to the original. They didn't have a lot to offer for me story-wise. I didn't much care for them. They were almost strictly on the Nintendo DS, though there were some Wii versions. And again, they're just average. They weren't as annoying to play by yourself as the original Crystal Chronicles, but still, just not that great. What I do want to talk about are the other Crystal Chronicles games because they're deliciously wacky and different. You see, I don't really mind Final Fantasy experimenting, so long as we keep some of the original parts of the series the same. And Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles was an excellent way to do that. We got the 2DS games, I believe Echoes of Time and Ring of Fate. We got the original one on the Gamecube, but then we got three delicious little download titles. Two delicious download titles, and one that's for the discs. In order, we got Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, My Life as King. This was an interesting game. It was basically a city building game, similar to ActRaiser or SimCity. You, as the king, could buff people's resolve and give them a chance to make your city better. You could make planning for the city, and it was all within a big castle environment. It was a very nice, relaxing game. It did get repetitive after a little bit, but the meat of the game was just going around and seeing what was going on, talking to the citizens and all of that, and just making them feel good about themselves, making them feel good about the city that they were trying to build. It was a very compelling experience, I think. Now, the problem with that game comes a little bit later. Yes, it could be repetitive, and it could be very hard to level up your city, and the end boss was beaten by adventurers that you hired to basically get materials, not by you. But the big problem with that is the DLC gouging. You see, Square, with the advent of the Wii, discovered that people would pay extra money for extra content. And this is going to become a real problem in the next generation, but they decided that they were going to piecemeal a lot of their games on the Wii. This was true of Crystal Defenders and Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. This was true of Final Fantasy IV The After Years, much maligned. And this was true of My Life as King. A lot of the structures from different races, like the Lilties, the Selkies, and the Ukes, piecemeal. A lot of the upgrades, piecemeal. A lot of the outfits, piecemeal. It was frustrating as all hell. Then we got another game that was almost totally different. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, My Life as a Dark Lord. This one was, ironically, a tower defense game. But unlike Crystal Defenders, it did it in an interesting way. You are literally in a tower defending it. The adventurers come up floor by floor, and you can set traps, things to slow them down. You can set monsters. It's actually pretty interesting. The story is very cutesy, and it has about the same graphical prowess as My Life as King. It's very interesting. The graphics are very cute, and the aesthetic is distinct and unique. The music is charming and very calming. Nothing Nobuo Uematsu worth, but it's okay. It was a fun little game. I really liked My Life as Dark Lord because it had a nice tongue-in-cheek story, the combat was very satisfying, and the bonuses you could get for surviving were quite cool. It even continued the story from My Life as King. Now, the problem comes back to DLC gouging. You could get one outfit for your main character without having to pay money. Extra units? Money. Kane the Dragoon? Money. Rydia's outfit from Final Fantasy IV? Money. Money, 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 money! Square was willing to gouge the crap out of its customers, and I just was not willing to pay. Really, the game is fun, but honestly, they were so busy price gouging during this period. Thankfully, the last title that we're going to be discussing does not have price gouging. I know, I'm surprised too. This one actually came out kind of in the middle, between Square's discovery of DLC and their price gouging out the ass. This was Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles The Crystal Bearers. This was a game designed solely for use with the Wii motion controls, and I gotta say, while it's a mishmash of odd design choices in video games, I really like it. It's not a long game, and I think that's for the benefit. Using the Wii's motion controls for terribly long could be very exhausting and frustrating, to say the least. So I think they actually made the right choice by not making a game that would be too terribly long. So, what's the game about? Well, you're basically about a guy named Lael. He's a crystal bearer, meaning he's got a crystal shard embedded in him, which grants him superhuman powers. In Lael's case, it's telekinesis. How does he use this? Well, you got two modes of gameplay. Your standard open field one is telekinesis play. Enemies appear, and with your Wiimote, you can pick up and throw things at them. And you can throw anything. You can throw even other enemies. It's actually pretty cool because later in the game, you need to spin enemies, you need to try and use their powers against them. It's a really cool idea for trying to make the game more dynamic and longer. I really like it. The problem lies in that this is kind of all the game has going for it. Now, normally you'd say, well, isn't that enough? Not exactly. The telekinesis gameplay can be a little fiddly. The Wiimote works most of the time, but when it doesn't, it just makes the combat system feel very frantic and frustrating. Granted, the game is pretty short, 4 to 6 hours, so that's not too big a deal. The other side of the gameplay coin is minigames. You have a ton of them. Lael jumps out of an airship in the first, 10 minutes, and you have to use the Wiimote to aim a gun. You have to use the Wiimote to bump butts at a beach party with girls. Yes, really. You use the Wiimote for all of these things. From boarding and, fighting and, flying in the sky to all of these. The story, though, is actually pretty interesting. While it goes a little too fast for its own good, we meet a crystal bear from the Uke tribe. Now, bear in mind, this is well after the Ukes were supposed to have vanished from the world. The Ukes were dead, basically. They were not coming back. And then one appeared. This is pretty interesting in its own right. But what's also interesting is that you get a lot of set-piece battles and a lot of twists. The Ute Crystal Bear is not actually the bad guy, though it seems like it, and when they summon Bahamut to fight you, it kind of feels like it, but they're not the bad guy, and the real plot twists, the changes in race dynamics from mostly egalitarian to imperialistic, it actually makes the story pretty compelling. The graphics are pretty good for the Wii, actually. They're really nice to look at. All the races look distinct, and there's a lot of cool effects. Honestly, the game's weakest point is the music and the combat. The world itself is a beautiful place to explore, but the combat is not that great. The minigames are okay, though. I really like the Crystal Chronicles series at times. Not all the time, they're not classics, they're only okay, but generally I would say they're pretty good. I like them enough that I would actually keep them in my collection, and not be embarrassed to say that I do like them. The Crystal Chronicle games did something different, and they weren't trying to be original Final Fantasy. That's okay. You really didn't even need the name Final Fantasy on there. You could just call it Crystal Chronicles. I don't mind them sharing the name, though, because, they were just trying to do something different and give Nintendo fans a little bit of their glory days back. The Crystal Chronicles series is still possible to continue, but it hasn't really in years, so I doubt that it will. We're going to talk a little bit more about the price gouging antics of Square Enix, but forgive me and allow me a little bit of an indulgence, okay? Next time we're talking about a game that I both love and hate, that's dear to my heart for what it tried to do, but also makes me hit my head against a wall for what it failed to do. And then we talk about the change in eras. Next time, before we talk about the change in eras, we're talking about Final Fantasy Dissidia. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. All right, everybody. I'll see you later.